Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, Duet Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and today we are talking about Cyclops, a satyr play. Written, directed, and performed by Griffin Hewitt, loosely inspired by Euripides, and maybe also a bit of Homer. It is produced by Panic Theatre and presented by Talk is Free Theatre, currently running in Toronto at the B Street Arts Hub until Saturday, April 4th, 2026. So there's still a little time left to see it. To talk about this show, I am joined today by a recurring guest who hasn't been around in a while, Max Aackerman. Hello, how are you doing today? We're good to have you back.
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Yeah.
It's real. I appreciate it.
No, we always love having you here. I think the last episode you were on was playing Shylock, which
I think that's right.
Over a year ago now, so it's been
And
long
I think
overdue.
that I've done certainly the past two episodes I've done with you were playing Shylock and
our Jewish editorial.
Yeah, exactly, and Indecent.
Yes, Indecent was way back in the pandemic.
Well, I love talking about Jewish theater. It's refreshing to be able to talk about.
And I've been meaning to get you on a non-Jewish episode for a while because, well, you are my go-to Jewish interlocutor for talking about our often disagreements about how Jews should be represented on stage. You'd have a wealth of knowledge about all kinds of theater things, and it's great to get you talking about things that aren't so Jewish.
I'm excited. This is a fun one.
We're gonna get started talking about this one-eyed whatever this is, but first I have to ask you our favorite icebreaker question. What is in your cup today?
I have today just water. I think I might have had water last time as well, but
I do too.
Good. Okay, you know what? It's important to stay hydrated. And I saw Project Hail Mary today, actually.
Oh, cool.
And I was in a movie theater and I was like drinking my Diet Coke and having a great time. And then I got home and I was like, I don't actually think I've had a glass of water to drink today. So this is for health and hydration and a good theater discussion. And also it's in my mug of the first time that I went to Edinburgh with my dad. So
oh, fun. Did you see the Fringe?
Not that time. We went outside of the Fringe. That was the next time I went. I was
you've done the Fringe there, yes, with your Dr. Faustus. Okay, well that's exciting because this show sort of has a fringy, even perhaps Edinburgh Fringe vibe.
It does. It does for sure.
Oh, also, yes, I am also drinking water in my The Cup Cup. Hey, that's the show you're currently watching and or listening to now. I usually try to have some sort of exciting coffee or Yorkshire tea, perhaps, but I just ran right home to do this recording, and I've already had enough caffeine today, so stay hydrated seems like a good idea. So, Cyclops, a satyr play. First thing first, satyr or satyr?
Well, it's funny because I also say satyr, but also not to bring up Jewish stuff, but as we're approaching Passover, it's important to define it's not
you just
satyr.
Can't talk about anything without getting into Judaism, it seems.
It does seem that way. I think a lot of my friends would probably agree, but yeah, so not Seder, like a Passover Seder, but Satyr, Satyr, the Greek creature who's half goat and half man.
There's a lot of man in them.
And there's some might say too much man in them. It's a really interesting form because, as we talked about when going to see the show, there's only one. We only have one. And so, I always say satyr.
So do I.
Satyr, I think satyr is also, I think it's a question of like Godot or Godot.
Yes. I think Griffin says, I think Griffin in the show said satyr repeatedly. So
I think he did.
So we have it right by the authority of the show. Okay. Yes. Just don't want people to get in the comments and be like, oh, well, actually, it's satyr.
Right.
But,
they will one way or another, I'm sure. And we love that
we appreciate
all of the listeners.
Yes.
It's keep us honest.
It's good for engagement, if nothing else. So, Max, do you want to get us kicked off with a non-spoiler description of what this show even is?
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy show to talk about, even without spoiling, partially because it's a story that a lot of people know. But at its most basic, it's a play about a satyr who kind of is adjacent to and present for Odysseus's encounter with the Cyclops. It's a story about this kind of famous mythological event from a perspective that we don't always get to see, and a perspective that's a little bit more raunchy and humorous, but also, I think, in many ways divorced from the idea of heroism, which is obviously really important when talking about Odysseus and Greek heroes is really important. So being able to see this story from a different perspective is really interesting. I don't know if I should talk about what that story actually is. Do you think it's worth getting into
I would say
So
for those who are uninitiated.
in the Odyssey, which of course is a very long and literally epic story, there's a brief chapter where Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, after leaving Troy, finds himself on an island which seemingly has no human inhabitants, but he and his men discover that it's home to a terrifying giant with one eye. To kind of move through the story quickly, they end up getting captured by the Cyclops, and then Odysseus, in his famous trickery, comes up with a plan to basically get the Cyclops very drunk and then gouge out his eye. And then the other famous part of this story is, oh wait, can I talk about this
Yeah,
yet? No.
no, please do. It's so fun. Sorry, I just think it's hilarious. It's the
It
funniest
is,
thing I ever
well,
read.
yeah. So the like kind of trick, right, that Odysseus pulls is that when the Cyclops asks, because he's blind, who's there, he says, "Well, my name is Nobody." And so then when the Cyclops' father Poseidon ends up coming and saying, "Hey, who did this to you?" The Cyclops has to say, "Nobody did this," and that's the kind of Homer's joke in the Odyssey.
Which is
Um,
such a stupid plan. Like
it's a
that's
yeah,
what I love about it. Like Odysseus is banking on he will use this exact turn of phrase
right,
that will then
right.
trick people into dismissing his complaints about his eye.
Yeah, well,
Because
and also hilariously, this doesn't happen in Cyclops the play, but for anyone familiar with the Odyssey, it doesn't work. Like,
well, yeah, he still
Poseidon
gets
still
cursed.
punishes him, and like he still has to reap the consequences of his actions. But yeah, it is a pretty great little narrative moment for sure.
One thing I'll add for the purpose is before like there's like, I guess multiple layers of this I'm realizing now like as we're talking because there's that story from the Odyssey
Yeah,
and then the satyr play the Cyclops by Euripides, the one surviving
yeah,
satyr play we have. I guess to maybe back this up also for those who maybe didn't study theater history and aren't familiar with this is that in ancient Greece there was the festival of Dionysus where several playwrights at a time, tragedians, writing trilogies of tragedies, would put forward these interconnected pieces that are all on a similar character's journey or theme, three tragedies, and they would add one satyr play into this cycle. So it was kind of like a quadrilogy in a way. Is that a
yeah,
word? Is that the proper term
yeah. It is now.
for a play cycle? Three proper tragedies and one little satyr play. And the satyr play was always something that was like a little comedic interlude that featured these horny goat characters from the mythology, and they would usually get into some kind of shenanigans on the periphery of the main story. So while we
Right.
don't have the three tragedies by Euripides that accompanied this one surviving satyr play, we can assume that it probably was three tragedies inspired by the Odyssey. And then for the Cyclops episode, that's what we're going to give to the satyrs because that's funny for
Yeah.
them to engage with it. So that's what our starting premise is first that mythological precedent and then that theater history precedent. But what is Griffin doing in this show?
Well, it's really interesting because, one thing that we talked about a little bit, and I think before we like fully dive into the show, I think it's worth noting, and it's interesting also because like this kind of theater history is actually not taught nearly as much as I wish it was, but also certainly as it was in previous generations. But one thing that's really important to note is that when we think about the foundations of theater and dramatic theory, Aristotle's Poetics is like the foundational document for Western theater, right? But Aristotle's Poetics only covers tragedy. The chapter on comedy is lost. And so much of our understanding of the theatrical form comes from understanding tragedy. And when we see even contemporary directors stage tragedy, there is an understanding of what are the rules, like what do we need to follow, and then what can we bend and break and experiment with, because experimentation, part of what you need for experimentation is an understanding of what are you forming a hypothesis from, what are you forming a reaction to.
Know the rules so you can break them.
Exactly, right. And with satyr plays, we don't really have that, right? We only have one existing satyr play. We've got Greek comedies that we can gain some understanding of kind of culturally what they're trying to do, but there's much less of a basic structural understanding for artists to go back to and use to inform their interpretations. And so off the bat, like it's impossible to say whether this is a good satyr, like good interpretation of the satyr play or not, because we just don't know. This is a very contemporary and contemporized adaptation of Euripides. I think one of the things they do quite well is it's very accessible. It's not just that the story is told with some degree of clarity, but that the character of the satyr and his problems and the kind of Panic Theater has kind of done an interesting job of injecting a certain modern anxiety into this satyr, and so it's not nearly as lighthearted as I think it probably would have originally been performed as. When I used to teach Greek theater, one of the things that is essential to remember about theater, Western theater, and really all theater in general, is that from the beginning of time, human beings have found dick jokes hilarious.
Mhm.
And like that is a fundamental truth of storytelling. Satyr plays are raunchy and in many ways gross and hilarious in how they lean into those kind of basic carnal human feelings and emotions. And so Griffin is doing a lot of that, that's for sure. It's a lot of like, what do we look like when we've made really bad decisions based on really basic human impulses?
Yeah.
I don't know how much more. I'll toss it to you, Ryan, because I think like that's a sort of basic
Yeah.
overview, but we'll get into it a little bit
I
more.
think just something I don't think we've mentioned yet is this is a solo show. It is written,
Mm-hmm.
directed, and performed all by Griffin. He
Yeah,
engages the audience very closely. It's pretty easy to avoid the audience participation if anyone's listening to this
yeah.
thinking that that's a reason that they don't want to attend. Stay off the couch because it's in a
Stay
very
off the
small
couch, but
space.
you will. He's going to look you dead in the
He'll
eyes.
look you dead in the eye, but he won't make you sing. Don't make me sing.
He won't make you
So,
sing. It's a
yeah.
hard play to hide from, and I actually think that, like, to its credit, there's a lot of plays where I myself, as a spectator, am like, I'm just going to sit in the back row and I'm going to wear my hat and I'm going to like keep my head down and just enjoy the show. And there are some plays that don't ever allow you to do that. And this is like you are in the play whether you like it or not. You're not necessarily engaging in the way in like an immersive way, but it is immediate. Like it
Yeah.
is really in your face.
And some people are made to engage in an immersive
Yeah.
way. He seems very
Yeah.
respectful that if you like really say no, I don't want to, I'm sure he wouldn't force you, but it's
Yeah.
a small space where you don't want to be the one stick in the mud who's not. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
there is a couch among the very limited number of seats for this that you should avoid if you don't want to have to sing karaoke with a goat man, because
Yeah.
that is what this show may demand of you. I guess maybe this is a good way to get into some of our still non-spoiler but general appraisals of what did you
Yeah.
think of it.
I really liked it. And in many ways, and I say this, I'm going to try and say this with no ego, but in many ways, like a lot of the directorial choices are directorial choices I think I would have made as well. So it feels like a show that I can creatively really get behind and understand why certain choices were made. It's fun, it's short, which is, I think, like a real benefit to this show because the way that it's been adapted with this kind of added layer of contemporary anxiety, there's a risk of like how deep are we going to fall into that, and I think that the length really curtails that in a good way. Technologically, despite them not working in a theater space, they've done some really interesting things with projection. I think Juliette Jones, her music is wonderful, and I think the music in the show is really great. Griffin sings very beautifully. I think that like for a modern take on what is in the grand scheme of things a really difficult show, it succeeds in being funny, being creative, being thought provoking, I think. And you might not, I don't know if you'll agree with all these things, but like certainly those three things it's really effective in. And then also like I think with immersive shows like this, and part of the reason that I say, you know, I understand a lot of the directorial choices is that it, you know, Dr. Faustus definitely like there's a lot of similarities between this and how we approach Dr. Faustus with microphones and they use music and lighting and all these things.
And audience
Um,
participation too.
and audience participation, and voluntary audience
Mhm.
participation. Yeah, it's a show that really will affect you if you let it. And I think that that's also a real credit to the production.
I think that's fair.
And I don't say that a lot, as you
That's,
know.
yeah, I know. It's high praise coming from you. To me, I'm kind of two minds with it. I think I had a lot of fun watching it. As a comedy, it succeeded at making me laugh, making me smile and chuckle, and because I am familiar enough with the source material and the various mythological and theatrical antecedents that it's playing with, I'm able to be like, aha, yes, a dildo is
Mhm.
like a phallus. Good job.
Yes.
Maybe I just failed to let it affect me the way that it affected
Mm.
you, but I didn't really feel like there was more to it than just, oh yeah, I'm laughing and having a good time. And it's actually funny
Mhm.
because we were just talking about this in the lobby waiting to get into the show about
Yeah.
how because of the way that Western culture and dramaturgy and history has subordinated comedy in its
Mhm.
grand tradition. And part of that is just due to the quirk of luck with the fires of Alexandria that we don't have half of Aristotle's Poetics, so we
Yeah.
don't have a framework for intellectualizing it the same way, which is often to its benefit. I had a professor once who
I
said
agree.
that we're not able to be as pedantic about comedy as we are with
Mhm.
tragedy. People will say, well, that's sad, but I don't know if it's tragic. But nobody would say, well, it's funny, but I don't know if it's comedic,
Right.
which doesn't
Yeah.
make any
Yeah.
sense to us because we don't have that. So, yeah, like if something succeeds at making you laugh, it succeeds at comedy. But we were talking before about how we uphold the tragedies in the same way that we kind of look as comedy of something frivolous. And I was kind of hoping, like, with the history and the pedigree of what's behind this, I was hoping it would maybe do something a little more elevated to kind of bring that comedy form to something that to me seemed like more than just cheap laughs. And I think a lot of what I
Mhm.
got from this kind of never quite ascended beyond that.
I think it's a really interesting point because I also think that like we're in a place right now culturally when you look at, there's this all this discourse around like why is the bear competing in the comedy section at the Golden Globes, right? It has funny moments, but it's not all that funny. So, and when we think about whatever Chekhov, the kind of foundational modern comedies, what we consider comedy, right? Chekhov always like classified his plays as comedies, despite them really not only not being funny, but being actually incredibly
They can be
depressing.
funny if they're
And
directed well.
if they're directed well, there's this great, as I'm sure this great Mel Brooks quote where he says, tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die.
Yeah.
I think that is the kind of crux is like what's interesting about this show is we're not laughing at the satyr, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're laughing with him because we've all been there. Like we've been there. When I say we've been there in like making bad decisions and having a long night and drinking too much and letting that affect, right? Like sleeping with someone that you don't want to sleep, whatever it is, right? We can recognize the comedic nature of those circumstances. But I think that you're right that it doesn't go much deeper than that. And I think partially it's an hour and it's a one person show. And so it's accomplishing kind of what it can within that time. But I agree with you that it's nice when we get to laugh because we really understand a character and laugh with the character versus just going, look at this stupid situation this guy is in. Like that's hilarious in and of itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's valid. I think we're dancing around a lot of maybe more specifics we want to get into. Is there any last thought you want to say before we put up the spoiler shield?
I guess I would just say like something that we had talked about at the theater as well is appreciating a show for the things that it does offer versus the things that it doesn't. And I think that, I mean, both you and I, as academics, it's very easy to dive in. And I also note Ryan is professionally an academic.
Yeah, barely.
I don't have the titles or qualifications, and I don't mean to usurp that title,
But
but as
I am not gatekeepy about any of this. We approach this from a more academic oriented perspective. You
exactly.
also were raised in academia in a way that I wasn't.
Certainly, I've taught theater, and I like to think about theater in an intellectual way. I think that sometimes, as audience members, we do ourselves a disservice to think about the intellectual side of theater being the most paramount thing. That sometimes something can just be entertaining, or sometimes something can just be beautiful to look at, and you can appreciate it. If that element is done well enough, then it can be a worthwhile experience. I think it's very rare to find a piece of theater, especially because, like, with theater making, so many things have to go right
Mhm.
for all of those boxes to be checked. So, like, I think this show succeeds very strongly in a few of those really important qualities. I don't think it succeeds across the board. I agree with you that, like, from an academic perspective, I don't know if it engages with the source material in a super deep way, but I think visually it's really impressive. I think the performance was really strong. I think sonically, like the soundscape and the music is really, really good. And it's funny. And
Yeah,
like being funny is not an easy thing to do. And so like those are all I want to give credit where credit is due, because those are all, I think those things all really succeed.
Yeah, I'm with you on all that. On that note, maybe we'll want to dig a little deeper into some of the
Let's do
things.
it.
So, once again, for anybody considering seeing this who doesn't want any spoilers, this is Cyclops, a satyr play written, directed, and performed by Griffin Hewitt, loosely inspired by Euripides and maybe also Homer, with original music by Juliet Jones, produced by Panic Theatre, and presented by Talk is Free Theatre, currently running in Toronto at B Street Arts Hub until Saturday, April 4th, 2026. Now, what's this? It's a red solo cup that says spoiler on it. That's showing up on the screen right now. I thought about doing a dildo, but I did not want to have a dildo on the screen for this whole
Yeah,
episode. So
that's fair. You got to keep it family friendly.
red solo cup. Let's do it.
Yes, red
Spoilers.
solo cup.
Okay, we are in the spoiler zone. Where do you want to start?
That's a really good question. Well, do you want to start with things we liked or criticisms? I mean, because I think that like, yeah.
I like starting with the positives.
Well, like I said, I think there's this really interesting, like I think the characterization of the Cyclops was really interesting. First of all, it's a lot of the satyr telling us, or us actually, like an audience member actually speaking and acting out the Cyclops' lines. And so there's always this kind of mystery about the Cyclops. But I also think there's this continued element, this projection that's almost like 2001: A Space Odyssey-esque, like HAL-esque, where it's this kind of abstract eyeball that grows and shapes and moves and changes with music. And I really love that device. Like I think removing the Cyclops from the classical mythology around like what does this monster look like, and creating this much more abstract idea of what does it mean to be watched, the eyeball as a symbol, I think like that was really effective for me. And I also think just from a aesthetic standpoint, their use of color was really fun, really simple. Like there's a simple disco ball that's used, you know, consistently and creatively. The world of the play is really clear. When you walk into the theater space, the performance space, there's solo cups and cans strewn all about. There's a dildo on the floor. There's a karaoke machine. There's like a kind of lo-fi beat, like kind of pounding in the background, and the satyr is lying passed out on the floor. And so all of that really ushers you in a really immediate way. I think that was really effective. And the other thing that I want to like shout out is that, you know, in Greek theater, Greek is heightened, Greek theater is told through heightened text and poetry. It's not realistic in the same way that we understand theater to be now, Western theater at least. And I think that the use of song, there's a lot of songs, and that it's kind of framed in this karaoke room environment. But the use of song, I think, is really effective. The lyrics are very beautifully written. Griffin is a wonderful singer. That's a nice play on the form. I think that's also something that I got a lot out of there.
Here to everything you're saying. I do really like, the way that Cyclops was visualized, I think is neat. And it's funny because we get the description of him, that picture like double Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson with a big
in a trench coat.
In a trench two Dwayne "The Rock" Johnsons in a trench coat with a big eye. And considering that Odysseus is represented on the screen by Brad Pitt in Troy, who's Achilles. He's not.
You've got to imagine that's an intentional choice.
I can't imagine he hasn't seen Troy.
Yeah, right.
He's like, oh, I know. I'm going to do Odysseus. That's who Brad Pitt played in Troy, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to look this up.
Yeah. Well, it's very funny also because, like, obviously we're getting the Odyssey. It was like this year, I think.
Yeah, Matt Damon is playing Odysseus.
And Matt Damon is playing Odysseus, also very attractive. Like, there's this kind of reoccurring bit that Odysseus is incredibly sexy. The satyr really wants to basically have sex with Odysseus, and that he's really seduced by Odysseus. And I agree that, like, if it is a self-aware joke of picking Achilles instead of Odysseus, there is something really funny about that. Also, just like to be able to think about from a mythological perspective that Odysseus and Achilles have this like long-standing rivalry. Odysseus is the one that gets Achilles' armor, right? And that like there's this real serious rivalry then also between Odysseus and everyone else. Odysseus is also just such a complicated figure in Greek mythology, unlike Achilles, who's pretty straightforward. Like
he's got the rage.
He's got the rage. Exactly, right? And that Odysseus is much more complex. The idea that the satyr would like think of Odysseus in such a like simple kind of homina sort of way is, I think, quite funny, and I think is executed well in the show.
And
If self-aware.
well, it kind of works regardless of, because it's
Yeah,
almost just
yeah,
like, we get to tip our monocles at like a ho ho, we know that's not who that is, and we can
yes,
think of all these other additional layers. Death of the author, regardless of whether or not he thought
yeah,
those through, we can have fun laughing at it. I do like that if he did indeed kind of intend this, that it is just a joke for those of us who will recognize it as such, and yet the joke still works on like another level of, oh yeah, it's just hunky Brad Pitt in Greek arbor.
right, yeah,
That, and I like when highbrow type jokes still have something in there that's not like, well, if you don't get the thing I'm referencing, that
right,
it's lost on you. So
yeah,
kudos to that type of comedy there. And I do like that while we have this very blunt, very pop culture-y version of how Odysseus is represented, that even though we have this similarly pop culture-y description of the Cyclops as to Dwayne the Rock Johnson's in a trench coat with a big eye, I do like the contrast of having that as our mental image, but having that weird amorphous eye shape being the way it's actually visualized. He could have asked
yeah,
ChatGPT to do two Dwayne the Rock Johnsons in a trench coat with a big eye, and
right,
that could have been on the screen there, and that would have
yeah,
been funny too in its own right. But I think, yeah, there is something alienating about the way that eye looks, though, the way that it's always like different configurations of audience voices
hmm,
creating him. Sometimes he makes one person read this line, sometimes it's all of us. I don't know if there was like
yeah.
a rhyme or reason to when it was one or the other, but it creates this almost like Lovecraftian
Yeah.
unknowability of this creature.
Well, and I'd also say, like, I think that, and this is not from Euripides, but there's this kind of underlying theme of memory, certainly, but also seemingly like trauma, that there's some sort of traumatic experience that's sort of explored, it not super explicitly explored, but we kind of get to the bottom of it. But a lot of it revolves around memory and not remembering what happened, having to recount what happened. And I think the idea of the monster being a difficult thing to remember actually makes it also more scary, right? Because then it becomes this amorphous, like confusing amalgamation of all these different influences and references and things. And I think that in making it more abstract, it also plays into the idea of how you remember something is sometimes a lot more whatever scary or exciting or whatever than the actual event was. And I think in the idea of staging a retelling, right? That the satyr is retelling this story to us, that we're not getting the story directly, allowing for things to not sit in the world of reality is a real benefit to this performance in a lot of
Mhm.
ways.
We talked a bit about the music written by Juliet Jones. How did
Yeah.
you feel like this karaoke party aesthetic worked with the material?
I mean, it's a good like we're talking about the festival of Dionysus, right? And they talk about Dionysus in the play, and Dionysus is he's not the god of music, but he's the god of revelry. He's the god of drinking and wine. And music is a big, in the play, Griffin says he's not the god of music, he is music.
Mhm.
And I actually think it's a lovely concept and a lovely line to consider similarly, right? How do we conceptualize these things that aren't rooted and grounded in reality for us? And I think, yeah, like these festivals to Dionysus are about music, about drinking, about having sex. Like these are all elements of that original tradition as well. And so I think that it's contemporized in a way that makes a lot of sense. Like I think staging this in a modern kind of house party karaoke room setting is very adjacent to the vibes that you might have originally found for a play like this. I think that it also hooks you, like it gives you a real place to be, a place that's recognizable, that's clearly realized, and also because they're using such a small space, it's really easy to fill that out, right? They're not working with a stage that's like 20 meters across and 10 meters deep. They're working with basically a square of carpet. And I think they've utilized that small space well. The setting of it is really relatable and it's easy to put yourself in that position. And so when you're approaching text that is inherently really foreign and could be very confusing, situating it in something that feels real and tangible, I think really helps the audience slide into the play a little bit easier than having to construct a whole island and
Yeah.
monsters and all those things.
I think about like the setting because this is like a super small space. I don't even know. I didn't count how many individual audience members it can accommodate, but
Probably like
it's
20 people
I would
maximum,
yeah, no more than
maybe
20.
25. Yeah.
Yeah, and like it really does have that like karaoke room
Yeah.
feel of like you're just in there with them. I kind of wonder though, because I think about that in terms of, I guess, how far we've come or fallen rather since ancient Greece, where going to the theater was your civic duty, that everybody, the whole town came out and seen it.
Yeah.
And now this is the lowest of the low kind of scrappy indie budget by putting it into space. And like so many of Talk is Free's shows have been in these small spaces lately, that they're really trying to create the sense of intimacy. And I wonder if there is something to that about, is there like a move of proximation between that feeling of I'm doing this because it's what I do as a good citizen versus I'm
Mm.
here in this community, even though spatially, experientially, it's very different. I wonder if the small scale intimacy is the current equivalent of that civic participation.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point, and I think like I don't know how dantic you want to get with it, but like now we're in the realm
That's
of
what we're here
Plato,
for.
right? Like
Yeah.
that now we're talking about, well, what actually is, when talking about Greek theater, talking about what actually is the role of theater in the Republic. And for those who have not read Greek philosophy,
You're on Cup of
Aristotle,
Hemlock Theater.
yeah,
Like,
I mean,
this is what people are here
yeah.
for. Sorry, go
Yeah,
on.
right. Like, so just to kind of clarify, Aristotle comes, a long time after Plato, but Plato, I mean, relatively speaking,
He was his
but
student, but his greatest
yeah,
contributions
but
were after
his
Plato's time. Yeah.
that's what I mean. And so but Aristotle is reacting to Plato's Republic in writing the Poetics. And Plato in his allegory of the cave and all of his kind of philosophy around what is it that makes this ideal society. Ironically, of course, Plato did actually write plays. I don't think we have any of them, but
Uh,
like Plato
well,
was, we have one.
that's a theory that I don't think is proven, but because of, so it's in Puchner's book about the drama of ideas, where he hypothesizes that Plato was a failed playwright who then kind of got swept up by Socrates and decided that he could use something like a quasi-dramatic dialogue form
Right.
to get back at the playwrights for not letting him into the club, basically.
And but I mean, like what we do know for sure is that Plato engaged with theater, right? Theater
Yeah.
was an essential part of Greek
Every citizen went.
yeah, exactly, right. It was an essential part of Greek society, and Plato's whole thing is that theater, basically, like to put it in the most simple terms, is that theater is lying, and that lying and dishonesty do not have a place in the Republic. And what Aristotle says is that, well, no, it's not lying. And once again, we only have tragedy, but this is where the concept of catharsis comes about. That catharsis is the function of purging those negative emotions from us so that then we can go out and be the perfect citizens for the Republic. What's interesting about this, and I think that like what you're talking about in terms of kind of comedy as a communal event and the immersive nature of this play helping to form a really quick community within the audience, is that it does kind of pose the question, well, and it's also interesting because it's basically the first line of the play is like, why are we all here?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What are we actually here to do? What are we going to get out of this? There is something really interesting about uniting to laugh at somebody. It's not very nice, but I do think that like when you look at a lot of Greek and Roman philosophy, there is this idea of like the other man whose place in society is to be outside of society. That society needs someone to unite against.
The
And
pharmacon was what the Greeks called this.
right.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. And of course, we're in a much more sensitive and egalitarian society than the Greeks were. But I think there is something interesting to be said about the power that is given a group of people to then make decisions about the life and future of someone else. And there are at least one major time where we as a group have to basically serve as judge and jury for the Seder, for what is going to happen. We're given a choice. And this is really interesting. It's a kind of almost like theater of cruelty moment where they do pose it directly to the audience and we have to talk to each other. And that's a very, very rare thing to happen in theater. And so they do a good job of enmeshing us in the fabric of the show and building a community in a very short span of time.
Now let's talk
That
about that last moment where we do have to make the
yeah,
choice. Because throughout the play, he is introducing these karaoke songs that convey certain
yeah,
elements of the plot. And there's one moment earlier where he makes one individual audience member choose song A,
yes,
song B, that'll affect where the story's going. We have no idea of knowing what we didn't see and how differently
right.
the show would have shaped up as a result. But then at the very end, he gives three options: do nothing, kill the Cyclops, kill the hero. Then he's like, I'm going to leave and you will all decide amongst yourselves, but it has to be unanimous. And that
Hmm.
mandate of unanimity,
Unanimity. Yeah,
unanimity.
that's
Yeah,
right. I
that's
think.
it. I think that's it. But that mandate is what forces us to be communal with each other. We can't just get
Right,
into a shouting match or I do this. We can't just do a majority rule and then some people are
right.
grumbling that they want to do the other. We had a pretty agreeable audience. You were the
Yes.
first one, I think, who actually proposed which one we
Yeah,
should
you
do.
got to
And
kill the monster.
everybody just agreed. I think if we had gone just like a couple seconds longer, I probably would have said, "Let's do nothing," because why kill
Mm,
anything? What
interesting.
what was your insistence that the monster must die? I wasn't going to be the one not doing it. I've seen 12 Angry Men, but
Right.
I didn't want to
Well,
keep
I
us there
think
too long.
that
It's a short show.
yeah. Well, I think that I mean, first of all, like just knowing how the story goes,
Yeah.
you got to kill the monster. But also, when you're in this mythological world, narratively, that's what makes sense. And regardless of what the story is, like the hero kills the monster, that's the way it goes. We know that Odysseus has to survive. But I also think that there's this persistent question of the satyr's freedom and whether he is happy or not, and whether he is. And I think the only thing that really will change his fate in thinking about him as an autonomous individual, which of course he's not, but like, in thinking about the character in that way, the only thing that actually will free him and allow him the possibility of a different future is to kill the monster. But it's also like, I think the play proposes a kind of trolley problem to us a little bit, where it's like either you kill the monster and Odysseus and his men go free. Like you make a choice, and Odysseus and his men go free, or you do nothing. And if you do nothing, Odysseus and his men are all going to die. And so, do you remove yourself from the realm of moral responsibility, or do you take action and say, "I'm going to save the group and sacrifice this one life"? But of course, also interestingly, then it really depends on the telling that Polyphemus, the Cyclops, does not always die. He gets his eye gouged out, and
Yeah.
that sucks. But like
No, but he's killing
he
him.
nobody's well, and it's also right. Like this is not in the play, and it's also unless you read the Odyssey, not often discussed. But Polyphemus is the child of Poseidon,
Yeah.
and then Polyphemus has to go to Poseidon and be like, "Hey, man,
And that's why
someone
the journey
stabbed
takes
my
so
eye."
long.
Exactly.
It's interesting, this kind of choice that it gives us, because yeah, like it is inviting us to you decide the fate of this show. And I like kind of what you've mapped out here, that we didn't even have to explain our rationales for our audience because you
Yeah.
said it pretty quickly. And I was like, yeah, let's just kill the monster. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's what we're doing. Trolley Problem is a good way of framing this because there are ramifications for all of them. And because we don't get to see the different endings, or you could certainly go back and see the other endings if you want to, but you have to then
Yeah.
convince your audience to play
Hmm.
out a different ending. So
Hmm.
if you're just going to be that kind of boorish one, like, listen,
Whatever. Yeah.
I've already seen what happens when we kill the monster. Can we please
Yeah.
kill the hero? I think there is something interesting about being given that choice. I didn't necessarily feel like with the way that the play ended after that, that like that choice had a lot of weight, because at the end of the day, it's just a decision on which karaoke song am I going to sing. There wasn't like a
Yeah.
denouement about now I have my freedom and now I'm going off on my next adventure. It kind of felt like the freedom is maybe a bit of a it's a bit of an illusion, I guess.
Well, and I'd also say, like, I think it gets to a larger point, and this would be one of my criticisms of the show, is that the choices that the audience makes don't seem super consequential.
Yeah.
It's nice to be given the illusion of choice, but like it does feel like even in the first choice that's made by one person, there's this choice between two songs, which I think are like you choose between an old love or a bad decision.
Mhm.
And the song that he sings, while very beautiful, kind of feels like it could be a song about either of those
Yeah.
things. And so it does make me think, like, is it just the same song? And it does make me wonder, and it does kind of make me wonder, like, see it again, because it does make me wonder, like, is there actually a difference? And I think this is also kind of the nature of satyr plays in general. There's no lesson. right? Like we don't really leave this thinking that he's going to be different, just that like his life moves on. And maybe there's something to be said for that, but yeah, it didn't feel hugely consequential to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a missed opportunity when you're giving the
Yeah.
audience something as juicy as, oh, you get to make a choice, but it has to be unanimous. And maybe different audiences put more moral consideration into that choice. Maybe it takes longer. Maybe there's more
Hmm.
deliberation. With ours, I felt like it's just, yeah, let's just kill the monster. Okay. Oh, we did it. Now the show's over. Okay. Yeah, it didn't
Yeah.
necessarily
Yeah.
climax to anything morally, philosophically, narratively exciting to me, I suppose.
Right. I mean, for anybody who's even remotely familiar with the story, like you know what happens.
Mhm.
And so it's tough to, it's kind of the gambit of like the Diary of Anne Frank as well, where like how much are we really willing to invest that things are going to turn out differently than we know factually that they will,
Mhm.
right? Like it's or like Romeo and Juliet, right? Like how
Or
much are we
Hades
willing to
Town.
invest? Hades Town, right? Hades Town, great example, right? Like how much are we willing to invest that things could be different? And I think like in large part that's to the production team and to the actors to really sell us on that maybe something could be different. Hades Town does a great job of it,
Mhm.
right? Throughout it all, the character of Hermes is kind of telling us like, well, maybe things will be different, maybe things will be different,
Mhm.
while also reinforcing like like it's always going to happen,
But we
but we
sing it
really
anyway.
believe, but we sing it anyway, right? And we really believe in that story, and there is that, but we sing it anyway, right?
Mhm.
That there is a kind of moralization, basically, of like, okay, if nothing is going to be different, why do we keep coming back, right? I think actually a very similar thing could be said about the Diary of Anne Frank,
Mhm.
where like it's this kind of essential, it's become culturally this essential story, and the benefit of it is not the ending but the actual participation in the show and watching the show. I didn't really feel like I was getting that with this one, that like I didn't feel like I was doing something special or unique by watching this show. Just to use those two examples again, with Hades Town, it's a very distinct and unique adaptation of Orpheus and Eurydice that demands emotional investment, right? If we're not in love with Orpheus and Eurydice in that story, the show doesn't work. And the way it's written is like it's so difficult not to fall in love with those characters. With Anne Frank, we're watching a Holocaust story, and it's part of it is okay. We're investing in this story so that never again, right? So that we can kind of learn from this deeply human, tragic story. With this, I'm kind of like, okay, so we talked about dicks for a while, and like maybe like because I'm interested to know what you think about this as well. But there's this kind of weird undertone that maybe there's like a sexual assault plot line
Yeah.
happening here, and it's never stated even remotely explicitly, but there are things that are kind of hinted at in the way that decisions while drinking, bad decisions, and the nature of a kind of master servant sub relationship kind of play out in this. And it's important to note that satyr plays are, and Greek comedy in general, are very 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 sexual, and like a lot of the comedy is based in and around sex and sexuality, with like the phallus being like
Yeah.
the most important symbol of Greek comedy in a lot of respects. And so to kind of inject this hint at a very serious conflict and a very serious set of consequences, but never to fully go down that road, it's kind of like, okay, we're hinting at some sort of moral obligation, some sort of moral, like some sort of catharsis, but never really following through on it. I wonder if you picked up the same thing.
I definitely picked up a sense of that, but I actually kind of forgot that it was being set up after a certain point
Right,
because it didn't feel like it was going anywhere, and I was correct for feeling that way. Even
right,
if
right.
it, again, I don't know Griffin personally. I don't know like what inspired him to write this. What
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to speculate about his own
Of
traumas,
course.
and that's
Yes.
not my place here. But I, you know what I think is missing from this? That maybe this is a sideways way of answering your question.
Yeah. Well,
We're missing the tragedy that comes before the satyr play.
right.
Because
Right. Right.
in the 1960s, Laurence Olivier, or possibly John Gielgud, I would need to look this up which of them did this, but one of those eminent British actors did a production of Oedipus where after, he's gouged out his eyes, he's crying, it's like horrible, it's the tragic black hole of despair. They drop the curtain, instantly raise the curtain. He's dressed like a goat, playing the accordion, dancing around,
Right.
doing a little
Right.
shtick. And that
Right.
was jarring to its 1960s audience of like, oh my God, we
Right.
just saw this horrible tragedy, and then what are you doing? But that's
Yeah.
trying to recreate the function of what the satyr play was. We've had our catharsis, we've purged these emotions, but isn't it almost more devastating to be snapped back into? But it's all
Right.
fun and games. It's just a show, it's an illusion. And we should be able to not just feel for the person, to pity them and to fear that perhaps we will befall the same fate, but also think about the human foibles of it all, and that
Hmm.
dialogue that the two types of plays have with each other can really
Hmm.
engender that. Because we enter this show thinking we're seeing a satyr play, we're seeing a fluffy, frivolous comedy that has roots in the mythological tradition. It's riffing and parodying on something that is of a grand mythological scale, but is not itself a tragedy, does not accompany a tragedy. I think the attempt to satisfy my earlier critique of where's the there, what kind of elevates
Hmm.
this beyond just I laughed and had a good time, is perhaps an attempt to imbue some sort of tragic subtext in
Mm.
the absence
Hmm.
of the pretext of tragedy.
I think that's a really great point, and it's something that we also see historically all the time, right? Like the Grand Guignol, for example, they had their hot and cold shower methods where they would show the audience like the most horrifying thing you could possibly imagine, and then a lighthearted comedy. Or you know, you look at like Bunraku and Kabuki theater, right? In Japan, like there's so many key examples of there's a reason that the comedy and tragedy masks exist as one symbol and don't exist on their own, that they are two sides of the same coin. It gets to a larger conversation about, well, not just why but when do we make comedy, right? That's it's part of the reason why some of the greatest comedy that we have, whether it's film or theater, comes out of immense suffering. That suffering is essential in understanding what is funny and joyous. It's Shakespeare's great line in Henry IV, where he says, if all the world were playing holiday, sport would be as tedious as to work, but when they seldom come, they wish for come. And nothing pleaseth but rare accidents, right? We need one for the other to be effective. And I think it's a really, really good point, just also because we've never seen it before. We don't know the tragedies that preceded this. And of the tragedies that we have, we don't have any of the sadder plays. And I'm realizing as I talk about this, I'm saying sadder consistently. And so
We're just
whoever's
going that we
you're right.
established that there's ambiguity, lexically speaking.
Yeah. I mean, I think I like that this play is very short. I think that a 60-minute run for this like makes a lot of sense. All of the things that are good about this play, I think, are really supported by the fact that the run is short, that you're not there for a long time, because they're things that are novel until they're not. And I don't think they ever run out of that kind of willingness from me as an audience member to invest in those things, given that it's only 60 minutes. But if they were to expand on the themes that they're looking at and the larger context that leads us to this moment where this satyr is waking up on the floor and like surrounded by hands and whatever, I think there is something interesting there to explore. Well, it wasn't always fun and games. What does it look like for a deeply unserious person or character to be placed in an immensely serious situation? And that, I think, is where a lot of the comedy comes from, right? Is that like we're watching what otherwise probably would be a tragedy from the eyes of someone who is not really able to think about things in that way. And so, I think it's also worth noting that the fact is that in sadder plays, the characters are not human beings for a reason. We're not really meant to see ourselves in them in a deep way, that we see maybe our desires and our more carnal aspects of our personality in them, but we're not really meant to relate to them and say, oh, that's me, in the same way that, like, when we look at Oedipus, that's a human person. Despite the fact that he's got this mythological status, he's got basic human flaws and aspects to him that a satyr is never going to have. So I think it's a really good point that, like, yeah, we don't have that that kind of tragic tonic that ends up heightening the comedy, the proverbial salt to the comedic caramel, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very well said. And hmm, I feel like I'm working on another point in relation to this because I feel like maybe, bear with me as I try to suss this out, but
Take your time.
I think we don't know how to be tragic anymore, and we don't really know how to be comedic either. That you said like those.
Well said, Ryan. I'm doing a
That's a
little
little
golf club, little
okay.
applause for those at home. I think that's very well said. Please go on.
Well, there was a whole bunch of like discourse in like the 50s and 60s. George Steiner's The Death of Tragedy, Lionel
Death of
Abel's Meta
tragedy. Yeah.
Theater, that
Yeah.
in our secular age, it is just difficult to believe in the tragic inevitability or the black holeness of. There's actually a really great essay by the poet W.H. Auden called Christian
Right.
Tragedy, which is it's kind of like a little sort of like a review of Moby Dick almost, but basically saying
Mm.
that like Moby Dick is Christian tragedy to what Oedipus was for like Greek tragedy. And the argument that he
Mm.
says here is that for a Greek polytheistic society that believes in fate and inevitability, you look at Oedipus and you're like, oh, well, it must have always been this way. His parents tried to send him away so he wouldn't do these horrible things. He found his way back because of course he did. The gods demanded you can't outrun your fate. The
Right.
Christian tragedy is not the tragedy of inevitability, according to Auden, but the tragedy of possibility. That
Mm.
at any point in the journey, Ahab could have said, you know what, this is getting out of hand. We're turning the boat
Right.
around. But it's the fact that he chooses over and over again to keep going that through that compulsive
Yeah.
obsession that in a more Christian cosmology is that you have the free will here, you have your choice, and that is what leads you to tragedy.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we can even jump it forward by about 50 years and say, like, World War II also kind of fucked that up for us. That's my
Like yes,
one. That's my one
you're
F bomb. I realize I used
PG
it, and that's
13.
the one. PG 13. You know, if you look at modernism and absurdism, that's basically their argument is that we can't have we can't have genre in the same way that we did before when we know the reality of how cruel and horrific human beings can be to each other. That the idea of simple comedy and tragedy goes out the window, and then you get something right like Waiting for Godot that directly challenges the idea of genre as a concept. And you know, you look at any of the modernists, and you will see them reacting to that. It's interesting then staging things that are very explicitly capital T tragic and capital C comic, because you have to deal with that muddiness. You have to deal with the fact that we are in a postmodern culture that doesn't see genre as black and white in the way that the Greeks did.
It doesn't see
That
genre as anything but a prison for free thought that
right, and
confines
exactly,
us.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's why, like, you know, in Toronto we see very, very little Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the reason we see very, very little Shakespeare, part of the reason is that it's very difficult through a modern lens to rationalize something being purely tragic and purely comic. That all of the like Shakespeare that we see, basically, like no one, I mean, except for I guess Shakespeare Bashed, basically, that does your kind of most basic text first versions. That like any concept that a director is going to put on a Shakespeare play has to reckon with how am I dealing with these genres. And it's also like this is something that is constantly overlooked and drives me insane, but we're not just talking about genre, we're talking about cycles. That we're talking about comic and tragic cycles, and we're talking about steps and protocols that are followed in each of these kinds of stories. You know, it's part of the reason why, you know, when I talk about Romeo and Juliet, for example, Romeo and Juliet is often classified, well, maybe not often, but sometimes classified as a comedy, not because it's funny, but because it ends with unification, right? And it's interesting in this Satyr play because the Satyr play really doesn't end in unification. If we're talking about it from a purely classical perspective, it also doesn't fit very cleanly into the ideas of comedy and tragedy. It's funny, and so in that we know that it's comedic, But I mean, and this is just, I think, the nature of growing up as well, whether it's an individual or the human race, that things become less black and white, things become less clear the more and longer you think about something. And for this, we've had what, 2000 years? And so, and beyond. And so, like, this is not a comment on the production by any means, but I think that it is a challenge both as a director, but also, to directors in general to say, like, okay, well, how do I recognize the things that made this what it is? And then how do I translate that into something that audiences can digest in a 60-minute show? You know what I mean? And it's not an easy question to answer. So it's not a comment on Griffin's work. I think that, like I said, broadly speaking, he did an admirable job in contemporizing this and in making this accessible for a modern audience. But inevitably, there's going to be something lost because there's not that same clarity in what actually makes this funny. And if it's funny, can it also be complex? I mean, there are plenty of funny things that are very complex, but for something that, like a Satyr play, that is very simple by design, modern consciousness does not really like simplicity in that way. So it leaves us in a weird place.
When you talk about how World War II changed everything, hot take of the century.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think,
Well, there was also World War One, which
oh,
did
I
some
forgot
damage
about
as
that
well.
one.
But
That's why they call it that.
right. The
But like,
sequel was pretty brutal as well.
that makes sense for like just, the Adorno thing of like to write poetry after Auschwitz's barbarism, and like
Right.
it's kind of easy to wrap your head around the fact that, like, oh, things are really bad. Can we do comedy like in a proper
Mm-hmm.
capital C sense? And I think we see a lot of it, like, to return to our favorite topic of discussion.
Yes.
Have you seen a production of The Merchant of Venice lately that is willing to
Right.
be the comedy that is written
Right.
as? And it's
Right.
understandable why not, because I think we're in our modern consciousness or even postmodern consciousness, we are primed to think of, well, every villain is the hero in their own story, and every
Mm-hmm.
comedy that gets jokes at their expense, at their failure, can be flipped on its head if you put it from their perspective. It's Elphaba
Right.
from Wicked. It's
Right.
it's the Ugly Stepsister. They just came out with a new movie of that. Like,
Yes.
we can't just like let the villains be villains anymore, because
Right.
we are too primed to think that, well, we can't laugh at them because it's really shitty to be them. Oh no, there's another
Right.
curse word. But and like, I kind of get that, and I think that's an attempt at novelty and adding nuance and reshaping these stories. The thing that I think maybe I'm a little more irksome about is the fact that we can't have just proper tragedy anymore. When was the last time you saw a play, even a play that like is avowed as a tragedy or attempts to gesture towards tragedy, that has a definitively unhappy ending? When was the last
Mhm.
time you saw one of those that didn't have smirky laugh lines along the way?
Right. I mean, when I think about the shows that I've seen that do tragedy really well, actually, one of the ones that I do think about, and this was probably 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago now, or even more, but Stratford did do a really interesting Oedipus that Daniel Brooks directed. Gord Rand played Oedipus. That I thought was not just well executed from a audience perspective, but also from an intellectual perspective. Like, Daniel Brooks did a good job adapting Greek structure to a more contemporary setting, and I think was really effective. I also think of, like, Robert Icke, who not just did great Shakespearean tragedy, but he kind of wrote an adaptation of Oresteia, which interestingly started with Agamemnon. Um, and then it was Agamemnon.
Oresteia always starts with
Agamemnon.
Agamemnon.
Well, it depends who's Oresteia. You
Well,
depends
Aeschylus
who's Oresteia.
is. Wait, which ones do you know
Well,
that don't?
well, the I'm talking about the trilogy that is often compiled, not the single play of the Oresteia.
Yeah, the art that usually in Aeschylus's version is Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, Eumenides.
So this one was Agamemnon. This is why, like, Ike's. It's a brilliant version, but it's Agamemnon. Um, it's Agamemnon, um, Electra, and Libation Bearers, I believe.
Okay, so he like
Um,
inserted one of the Sophocles
yes,
Euripides ones in there.
yes,
Yeah.
but sorry, and I should clarify. Like, when I talk about the Oresteia, also what I'm talking about is there's just a lot of stories that tie in to
Sure.
the Oresteia that are often not, like, because they're not in Aeschylus's version, they're often left out. But my point is that it's all contemporary text, but there is this impending sense of, and I think like something that makes Greek tragedy specifically so great is responsibility. That getting back to Plato, getting back to Aristotle, it's all about responsibility, and responsibility to the state, responsibility to your family, responsibility to the gods, and that, like, that's what he really gets. The weight of responsibility is constantly, constantly present. And I've talked about this before, but like part of what I think is really handicapping us, specifically in Canada, but I think also just generally in the kind of theatrical discussions, because Hollywood is the dominant cultural influence, we're obsessed with realism, and we're obsessed with Meisner and the method, and like making things as real as possible. And you just can't do that with Greek theater. You can't do it with heightened text. That they're not realistic plays. The stories, the characters are not human beings that, I mean, whether they exist or not is really beside the point. In their forms as we tell them, those characters never were human people. Part of what makes them so tragic is that even the greatest heroes of all time, who are not like us, deal with the same issues and deal with the same weights, and like weight of responsibility, weight of expectation, arrogance, hubris, right? Like all those things, even they deal with that. Even the gods deal with that. And I think it's really interesting what you said about the kind of Christian tragedy versus, I'll say, like, not even, I mean, polytheistic tragedy, but
But
when you
Athenian
think
specifically.
when you think about Greek mythology, the gods are not examples. The gods are deeply flawed individuals who do horrible things to each other and the people. There's no idea of God being the shining example of how to behave in the same way that there is in Christianity. The understanding that flaws are not just a universal human experience, but a universal experience, period, is something that makes tragedy so important. Once we get in our heads the idea that there is something out there that is perfect, tragedy loses all its power.
Yeah.
Right? Once we get into our head that if I behave in a certain way, I'm going to get to heaven and I'm going to be happy for all of eternity, tragedy loses its power, because what your action doesn't matter anymore. And like, even if it does, okay, so you can repent and you'll be fine, right? Or whatever, like, whatever philosophy you ascribe to. But I think the idea of the universe being flawed is part of what makes tragedy so impactful, and it is also part of what makes comedy so impactful, because then you have to reckon with the idea that, like, okay, if nothing makes sense, then what are we supposed to do but laugh, like, but kind of make fun. Once again, it's part of the reason why we see so much great comedy come out of events like the Holocaust, for
Yeah.
example, or any kind of major traumatic event. A lot of comedians will use their own trauma as material, and it's a way to rationalize, and it's a way to explain, and it's a way to connect. Anyway, I've gotten off track, but that's, yeah, I think it all just gets back to the idea of, like, that's the kind of element that's missing from this production a little bit, is like, where's the actual, like, what's the flaw that we're talking about? What's the tragedy that we're avoiding talking about? That it's hinted at, but it's never really realized in a deep and personal way. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And I think the fact that it is hinting at it is almost an insecurity about just being funny or just being the
Mm-hmm.
frivolous comedy. And I
Yeah.
don't think that insecurity would exist if the comedy came as a literal relief after a tragedy,
Right.
but needing to segment it out on its own and let it stand on its own. I think it's trying to respond to my initial critique of, well, there's not much here. I'm sure I'm
Right.
laughing, but I think the more we talk about this, the more I think about it, it's trying too hard to do that, but with the wrong materials, because this is something that is just supposed to be the funny comedy that sends you home smiling after the tragedy, that allows you to process that catharsis after. But in the
Right.
absence of that tragedy, how do we can't just do a comedy. It's got to also be about trauma. Everything's about trauma. Every Disney movie is
Yeah.
about trauma. Like,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and we live in a traumatic age that there's good reason why that is the theme
And
du
an
jour.
some might say over therapized age
Yes,
as
very
well,
much
right?
so.
Where there's this language around mental health, mental illness that, and I'm interested to know from your perspective, Ryan, like this kind of psychedelic nature of this show
Mhm.
and the, I don't want to say formlessness, but this kind of ever changing, ever growing form. I mean, even of the eye, right? That we
Yeah.
see it kind of morphing and shaping. Like, based on what you just said, I wonder how that kind of ties into it for you, because I think there's this, once again, this idea, this kind of postmodern idea of like disorder and chaos that feeds into the comedy of it,
Mhm.
but also leaves us really questioning like where we sit in terms of the genre. And I wonder how that struck you, that the visual language of the show, as like, did you find it to be effective in creating a world where you feel like, okay, we're talking about these things, but there's still, it's so weird and strange that like I'm not sure we're even talking about them in a upsetting or tragic way, or did you feel like those things were kind of divorced from each other?
Hmm. It's a good question. I definitely didn't feel upset or tragic
Yeah,
about
yeah,
anything in this show, even the parts that are hinting at something deeper beneath the surface. I think the uncanniness of the eye, while an interesting image, gets tamed by the fact that we inhabit this persona of the Cyclops.
yeah,
And I think it actually produces a sense of identification that you said the figure of the satyr is actually designed to prevent the fact that it's not a man, like you said. It's interesting the way this show is, by being made today with today's sensibilities, can't help trying to produce some sort of identification, whether it's for the monster who's misunderstood, whether it's for the satyr who's actually a slave, whether it's for deconstructing the idea of the hero and, oh, is he really all that he's cracked up to be? This is just. I was at a conference recently, actually, where someone was giving an interesting paper about the high school canon of literature and
hmm
how like he did some very interesting quantitative work on which books are assigned in high school English, and he had like a really fascinating paper. I forget the scholar's name, so apologies for not giving him credit here, but he had a lot of very interesting conclusions from this, and one of them that really stuck with me is that coming of age stories are overrepresented in high school English
mm,
syllabi. As a result, when this is your formative learning how to read and critically analyze literature, we develop a bit of a cultural sensibility of reading all stories as if they're coming of age stories, and
hmm
that this formative Bildungsroman sense of you go through the crucible of narrative to become your true self, to learn about the world, to become a well-adjusted adult. That struck me because I think, yeah, that is just, it is the casualty of choosing books that you think people at teenage will relate to, that they'll find some sort
yeah,
of experience to. But like, I think one of the interesting examples of this is something like To Kill a Mockingbird, which
hmm
is a story about race in America that
hmm
is still taught like a coming of age story, because it kind of is, because
Sure.
it has,
I taught it myself.
yeah, it is about Scout's journey of learning about the
Yeah,
realities of race in America and prejudice, and using the allegory of Boo Radley to think about this from a different way while being
yeah,
confronted with the literalness of what's going on with Tom Robinson in the trial.
yeah.
But it teaches the high school students who then grow up to become adults who use this as their basis for critical thinking. It teaches them that the story of race in America is the story of your coming to terms with it.
I think that's a really interesting point, and there are a couple things that you made me think of, because I'll speak to Kill a Mockingbird first, because I think it ties into what we've been talking about with Cyclops. When I taught that book, I would teach it to my grade 7 students. One question that I'd always ask them is, why do we consider Atticus to be the hero of that story?
Mhm.
Right? I mean, aside from the fact that Gregory Peck is like incredible in the movie, he doesn't really do anything that's super heroic.
He does
He's
his job.
required, right? He's required to take Tom Robinson's case. He doesn't want to take it. He says he doesn't want to take it. He's required to take it. He does his job very competently, but he's also like, and yeah, sure, he sees the good in everyone and he has admirable qualities, but there's nothing uniquely heroic about Atticus as, this kind of central figure in terms of his like moral superiority. If you want to talk about moral superiority, the hero of the story is Tom Robinson, who just does good, right? He only does good in that book.
Yeah.
He does like literally nothing wrong. And that's the problem, right? And so it's interesting in thinking about how we conceptualize also heroes and villains and our need to be able to identify these basic archetypes within like, the mentor figure in the coming of age story, for example. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. But I think also in thinking about stories being a reflection of who we are, who we want to be, in talking about them kind of reading stories in general as coming of age stories and bringing it back to tragedy. The line that I always use is, arguably the greatest tragedy ever written, Hamlet. Ryan, I'm sure you know, what's the opening line of Hamlet?
Who's there?
Who's there? It's the longest knock-knock joke in human history, right? And the entire play, you could argue, is in searching for an answer to that question of who's there. That the nature of theater and the nature of storytelling in general is to seek for self-identification, is to be able to understand ourselves in relation to both our cultural history and those around us. And so it's interesting that this production chooses to, instead of having us along for the ride with the satyr, actually has us perform as the monster instead. That we take the role of the Cyclops, who is subjugating and dangerous and violent and drunk and like all of these things. It does make me wonder if the production is approaching that decision with self-awareness or if it's just an easy way to get the audience engaged. And that, I think, is something that, like, if it is being done with self-awareness, I would love to see more of why. Like, and love to have to question myself more. Not that I want to see somebody in pain or suffering, but like, well, is there an opportunity for us to make a decision that might really seriously affect this creature and might seriously put us in a position of moral responsibility? So it just gets back to what we were talking about before as well.
And the fact that you so easily led the charge to let's kill the monster, that's what we do in a story like this, proves the
Right.
failure of that identification.
Right. Right. Well, and also I think like it's just the nature of providing choices. Like providing, because the fact of it is like you can go, okay, kill the monster, kill the hero, do nothing. The reality of it is we like in an hour, we're not really put in a position where those choices are difficult. We know how on a most basic level, we know how our protagonist feels about all of those choices. And we know narratively which choices are going to make the most sense for the story. And so even if we don't agree with it, as audience members who want the story to progress and want to see it come to a fulfilling conclusion, there's just an obvious choice, right? And we know that in killing the monster, there's no real stakes to making that choice. While I do really like the characterization of the Cyclops, because the Cyclops is not a real individual, it eliminates any kind of like, you can't put a face to the person you're making this decision
It
about.
literally doesn't. It's just an eye.
Right. Well, and it's the same reason why, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's very different. But like the movie that is the kind of much more wholesome equivalent, which is Wall-E, which is like basically the same movie except like for kids. It's really easy. It's really easy to kill the
Otto.
scary, spooky. Yeah, Otto, exactly. Right. It's really easy to demolish it because it's not a person. It doesn't have a consciousness, a quote unquote soul in the same way.
Yeah.
Now, I do think that there is an opportunity here that I don't think was capitalized on to talk about the obvious like kind of big discussion topic, which is AI
Mhm.
being this kind of dominant, almost monstrous or otherworldly thing, and to think about, well, if you are positioning it, because and the reason I bring up 2001: A Space Odyssey is because this visual that they use for the Cyclops' eye is in many ways kind of reminiscent of that, like the
Yeah,
aesthetic of
Hal.
Hal,
Yeah,
and I'm also partially thinking about that. Like I said, I just saw Project Hail Mary, and that's a movie that's very inspired by 2001. But in thinking about the nature of a soul, we're now in a much more complicated position in thinking about artificial intelligence that feels and that creates, right? And I think there is a potential for an interesting discussion to be had there, but that doesn't even really seem like it was in
yeah.
their thoughts at all,
No, and
despite yeah,
yeah, I'm not gonna fault them for the fact that I'm not suggesting you are either, but like we've had an interesting conversation here that got us there.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, but I do think there's something is provocative about thinking of what if the monster is AI and maybe it has its own something approximating consciousness, but
right.
it also is so destructive, like the Cyclops, and it should be destroyed maybe, even if like there is something resembling humanity to it if it sings
Well,
a
and even
song
I
when you
mean,
deprogram it.
right, yeah. But I mean, like even in the original mythology, right? The Cyclops isn't of the human world.
Mhm.
The Cyclops is a product of the gods. And so it's easy for us to go like, well, he's a minor deity, like, he's a demigod.
But so is
The
Helen of
concept,
Troy, and we
well,
went to
yeah,
war
I mean,
for
fair
her.
enough. Yeah, right. And that's true. That's true. But I mean, I would even say with Helen and
Mhm.
with a lot of these, even Achilles, the stakes are different
Mhm.
in how we think about their the life and death choices that we make. With Achilles, there's never any question that like if Achilles dies, are we going to be sad about it? Probably. But like this dude is full of rage and like wants to kill everything in his path. It's just going to happen. Like, it's the same with Helen, where it's like she was promised. I mean, it's very difficult to read these stories from a feminist perspective because Helen has less agency than like almost any character in any canon ever, right? She's promised to Paris by Aphrodite, and then Paris takes her, and then she's basically held in Troy. We don't know how she feels about it until an army led by her husband comes to take her back. And that's the story. We don't get Helen's perspective unless you want to look at whatever, Troilus and Cressida, or these kind of
Ransacking Troy that was just at Stratford last season. Yeah,
exactly, right?
yeah,
You want to look at these more contemporary, not that Shakespeare's contemporary, but certainly more contemporary than Homer.
yeah.
Um,
Shakespeare our
and so
contemporary.
yes, right, right. And so humanizing these characters literally and figuratively is a challenging thing to do. And then in the age of realism, how do you reckon with a character that is not impossible to humanize, but in humanizing them you actually raise a lot more questions
Mhm.
than you answer, you know what I mean?
Well, that's what every Guillermo del Toro movie is what
Yeah,
if the monster has feelings? So have you
right,
considered that? And what if the
right.
humans, the straight-laced Michael Shannon type character is the real monster? I think that is another I won't call it a symptom, but like part of that same trend that I said about like the ugly stepsister gets a movie and we can't have a monstrous Shylock, we can't have any of these things
Yeah,
because, and it is a radical empathy for the other, the
yeah,
marginalized, the villains. Many of us recognize in most contexts that like nobody is all bad. If somebody is doing bad things, there must be a good reason. It
for a
must
reason.
be
Yeah,
from their perspective. How can we get into their head? I don't know if this play was trying to do that by having us embody the identity of the Cyclops. If it was, then I don't think it succeeded at getting us in the Cyclops' head because we very easily killed it. But
yeah, right,
maybe
right.
other audiences felt differently. It's also hard to take the act of killing seriously when the knife is a dildo. The,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that
Well,
therein lies the comedy.
and I think that that's a really good point because when we talk about every villain kind of needing their moment in the spotlight to be a hero, and also the emergence of the anti-hero,
Mhm.
the idea that no one is truly good or truly bad, the emergence of psychology as a field and like trying to rationalize decisions and not accepting things at face value. We live in a very complicated world and our understanding of psychology and the nature of
And
things
the
is
nurture.
very and the nurture is very complex. And so it's very difficult to talk about a show like this without that, but you almost kind of have to, because the nature of a satyr play is that it is simple. It has one purpose, which is to entertain you and to make you laugh. And it does so in the most basic of human ways. Dick jokes, fart jokes, sex jokes. Once again, these are fundamental elements of human experience that we've always found these things funny. You can look at any theater culture. If they're doing comedy, these things are there. And I think that, like, in some ways it is our job to overcomplicate things as
That's what we're doing
commentators and
here. Yeah.
critics, right? Like, and so we are overcomplicating, we're dissecting every little thing. But I do think it's important to recognize and remember that actually a satyr play is one of the simplest art forms you can create. It's got a very clearly well-defined purpose. It's got really, really straightforward characters. Like, there's no psychology to a satyr. And that's part of the reason why they are satyrs and not human beings. There's no like discussion of hubris,
No.
or right, with a satyr. And
Pure
so
libido.
it's pure, exactly. It's pure libido. And they are representations of that kind of pure, carnal, uncomplicated side of human beings. I think that this production does overcomplicate what the nature of a satyr play is, but I also think it does so by necessity. Because if it was just like, here's a sex show, or like, here's a comedy about sex, you just wouldn't get the same. Like, everything has to be a little bit serious for it to be taken seriously,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the same reason we see no comedies win at the Oscars. Like, it's the same reason the Bear has won the comedies, like I mentioned
Yeah.
before, right? In the comedy section of the Golden Globes, that the seriousness is what makes us look at it as, once again, like, quote unquote art.
Elevated.
Elevate, right? Exactly. And I think that it's a really difficult problem for these artists to reckon with, and I think they do it with a certain degree of success. Like, I think that they do find a lot of success in contemporizing and complicating this character, but I think that there is like just a basic element of it that's lost, which is just like, it's meant to make you laugh, and it's meant to be silly. It's the Marx Brothers, right? Like, it's slapstick comedy, and so it's a trade-off, I think, is my point.
Well, and I think this is to bring us all the way back to where we started with my
Yeah,
introductory light critique of I laughed, but I didn't really feel like it was elevated in that way.
yeah,
I think why I feel like I can stand by that as a critique, despite everything we said in this roundabout conversation that arrived us back here, is
yeah,
that it feels like it is trying to do more than just make us
yeah,
laugh. We can have the simplicity of the satyr play in the aftermath of the tragedy, but
yeah,
without the tragedy, there is too much of a vacuum that we need to
yeah,
try to fill with meaning. And this show, despite its best efforts, kind of lacks the meaning despite clearly gesturing towards some of it. It is the unfortunate blending of the desire for meaning, but the shallowness of what I think it comes up with that does not allow me to fully embrace it as something more meaningful than just comedy, but also doesn't allow me to embrace it as, oh, it's just comedy.
yeah. And I think, certainly, going into it, I was really hoping to, and it was very funny,
Mhm.
but I was really hoping to go into it and just be like rolling on the floor, like in the same way I would if I went to a stand-up show, and it's just jokes, like, and it's just joke after joke after joke. Like, if that had been what the play was, I don't think any of this discussion would be necessary, because I
No.
think both of us would have just been like, yeah, that was a really good time. Like, did it make me think about something? Maybe not, but like, at least we laughed. At least we
Yeah.
had a really fun, funny time. I think it was funny, and I think that, like, a lot of the jokes are well delivered. Griffin's timing is good. Those kind of fundamentals of comedy are all present. But you're right that it's trying to be more. And I think that this is part of a larger trend, certainly in theater, where it's just like, we cannot let the thing be the thing. When I say, like, a show can be aesthetically really great and substantively be kind of shallow, but I can still really enjoy the show for the way it looks.
Mhm.
Like, I think for a Satyr play, it can be really funny and it can be really raunchy and weird and stupid and not have a lot to say. And it still is a really rewarding and satisfying experience. I don't go into Step Brothers expecting it to change my life. You know what I mean? This play was, I totally agree with you. And I think that, once again, I liked it. I think
So
it
did
was
I,
good.
enough.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right in saying like where this play could have been Step Brothers,
Mhm.
where it's, very, 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 I mean, depends on who you ask, but like
Yeah,
in my opinion,
mine
very
too.
funny, but ultimately intellectually not anything. It kind of ended up shooting itself in the foot a little bit in trying to make a commentary and in trying to be, more like a Noah Baumbach movie and like try and talk about the perils of life while throwing in jokes and throwing in kind of situational jokes. But like that's the thing is it's just a Satyr play is never going to be that. If you want to have this deep philosophical discussion, I mean, even if you want to do Greek theater, there's other plays that do that and that are funny and that
Yeah.
can be funny.
If you want to play on
But
trauma, do Ion.
right, yeah. Well, you know what? I was thinking one of my favorite Greek adaptations in a play that nobody does
Mhm.
is Kate Tempest wrote an adaptation called Paradise of Philoctetes.
Mm.
For those of you who don't know what Philoctetes is, I'm not talking about the actually satyr from
Hercules.
Disney's Hercules. Philoctetes, also a member of Odysseus's band, who is very hard done by, and a very unusual, unconventional tragedy from now I'm forgetting which Greek writer wrote it, and I'm feeling very
Philoctetes, I think,
foolish
was
about that.
Sophocles.
Was soft? Yes, I think that's right. But anyway, like my point is, like there are plays where you can do that, and you also, because they're not done very often, you have the freedom to massage them into being what you want them to be. Cyclops doesn't really have that. Like Cyclops is so short and so simple that there's a lot of invention required. And like my question to contemporary creators is always like, why do all that work when the work has already basically been done for you in a way that is usually more effective and already provides you with a foundation for exploring and discussing the things that you want to explore? So yeah, I am definitely in agreement with you that like to do those things, maybe another play would have been better and easier. But also, I really had a good time and I really liked it, and
Yeah.
it was funny, and it was in some ways quite thought provoking. And so this is not at all to say that they failed. They were successful in many ways, but I think I just question the methodology behind
Yeah.
it. I think.
If nothing else, it provoked a lot of thought in us because we've been talking for a while.
Yeah, for
Any
sure.
last thoughts you want to share about this before we wrap up?
I think we've talked kind of in questioning or somewhat critical terms, but I really do want to take a second just to commend the artists one more time, partially just because like this is a play you never get to see.
Yeah.
And they took a swing at something that is unique and difficult and introduced audiences to a new play, which to a new, well, sorry,
An
to
old
an old
play that's
play,
new to them.
but
No new
to an
jokes,
old
just
play
new
that
folks.
is, yeah, well, that is very rarely produced. And we had the same experience when we did Faustus, where like so many people came up to us afterwards and said, like, I'm so glad you did this show. I've never seen it before. I've never gotten to see this show before. And so I think, like, to their credit, being able to experiment with classical form is something that I wish I saw more of. And so I'm really, really glad. And I want this like to be encouraging. Like I'm really glad that they chose to do that. And as with any experiment, you're going to have failures and you're going to have successes. And that's true with this show. But more than anything, the important thing is that they did the experiment. And that's really, really wonderful. And I want to commend them for that above everything. I wish I saw more of that. I really do.
Fail again, fail better.
Yeah, exactly.
All
Yeah.
right. I think that's a lovely note to end on. So we will
Yeah.
take the solo cup off of the screen, and that ends our discussion of Cyclops, a satyr play, Written, directed, and
Fantastic.
performed by Griffin Hewitt, produced by Panic Theatre, presented by Talk is Free Theatre, which is currently running in Toronto at the B Street Arts Hub until Saturday, April 4th. So if all of this sounded exciting to you, get your tickets because it won't
Yes.
be here for long. Max, thank you so much for joining me in this really weird but interesting discussion. They always are with you. So I
Thanks. Yeah.
appreciate the energy you bring to these episodes.
Always my pleasure, Ryan. Thank you so
No,
much.
where can people find and follow you and your theater company?
If anyone wants to follow me personally, I'm at M Ackerman 12 on Instagram. My theater company is Dandelion Theater, dandeliontheaterto.com or Dandelion Theater TO on Instagram. And then I also I run a performing arts academy called the Avenue Road Music and Performance Academy, Avenue Road Music on Instagram, avenueroadmusic.com. If you're interested in drama, in learning a new instrument, in learning how to dance, in picking up an instrument after a while, I'm very proud of us. We've built a wonderful arts community up there. And so we're at Avenue in St. Clair. I'm in the office every day. So if you want to drop by and say hi and see what we've got going on, come on by.
Yeah, we'll put all of those in the description of this episode. As
Great.
for us, we are at COH Theater on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are Cup of Hemlock Theater on YouTube, where you might be listening to this. Well, watching this because it's YouTube. Cup of Hemlock Theater podcast and all the podcast places where you might be listening to this. All right. Well, this has been an interesting, eye-opening discussion about
Indeed.
the Cyclops, a satyr play. That's it for us. We will see you next week with another episode. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you all then. Cheers.
Bye. Cheers.